Introduction, we will have 3 speakers, the project coordinators from the Horizon 2020 NEWBIE project and the Horizon 2020 RURITAGE project. The presenters will be William Altes, Andres Visser, and Claudia De Luca. For the second part, we will have the topic of the impact of COVID on young people in urban and rural areas. And hence we will have presentations from young people and youth organization by Sebastian Lasnik, chairman of the Rural Youth of Europe, and Nikita Saneula, policy officer of social and economic inclusion for the European Youth Forum. The third part will be resilience stories for COVID-19 generated new opportunities. We'll have speakers from the Ruralization Project Network, Deidre Divilli, the RURITAGE Project Network, Mr. John Moriarty. He will give a talk on behalf of the experience of Rory McGorian and of Kildina Farm, and from the NEWBIE project. Further, for the last part, we will have Alexia Rubia from the European Commission and Mikhail Nozhavokas, Project Officer of the Director General Education, Youth and Sport and Culture, speaking about the impact of COVID-19 on EU policies with a focus on youth and rural development policies. So before I leave the floor to Professor Cortels, our project coordinator, I would like to invite you all to visit our website and social media and to register to our newsletter and to be informed about next events and activities. In case any questions may arise, feel free to ask. Every contribution from your side is valid. However, I would just like to ask you to wait with your questions until the specific speaker has finished his or her presentation in order not to cause any confusion. All right, then, I would suggest we begin with our first presentation. Mr. Cortales, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Can you understand me? Welcome to this webinar, also from my side, and I'm going to present ruralization. This is about rural regeneration in European areas. Please, next slide. The perspective is that many rural areas face all kinds of issues. And we want to say return the spiral, provide more opportunities for new generations. We hope that more young people move into rural areas and less move out. So we counter what the currently is, that you have then a relative younger population, renewable population, and that ends again to more economic activities and more opportunities. And we do this through 4 ways: foresight analysis, kind of facilitating rural newcomers, new entrants to farming. We look at access to land, and we look at policy development. I mean, the current issue is of course different. You see that population growth in urban areas is still going on, and in rural areas, although some rural areas do very well, and in general they declining. And also GDP per head is a lot lower in rural areas than in urban areas. And one of the aspects we look at access to land, and as you probably have known, and you can see it here, that 3% of the farms cultivate over half of the land in the European Union. So this means also difficult for that only a small part of the land market is open to new generations who usually have to start some smaller farms or not that big ones. But it is also the cap subsidies go to the 3% of the farms because they are mostly based on land. I mean, this is. Next slide, please. Can I get the controls? Yes, this is our consortium. We have 18 partners from 12 member states. So from Spain, from Italy, from Hungary, from Romania, Poland, Finland, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, Ireland, UK, and France. Next slide, please. This is the work plan. We have done more or less most of the framework for research and innovation, and now we are currently working on 3 plus the foresight analysis, the facilitating rural newcomers and tools to provide access to land, and we will at the end of the conference, and we will of course are thinking also about policy design and assessment, and of course communication dissemination takes place all the way. And next slide, please. Then I go to the foresight analysis. And this is, of course, where many work is now being done. We are currently in the midst of a trend analysis, and we got, say, 1,560 trend observations made, and nearly 3,000 drivers of these observations. And we are currently turning it down to, say, normal, because people observe the same trends. So we have now about 30 topics and 27 other topics of drivers. And this was quite recently. We also have in this trend and drivers, the COVID-19 aspects are in it. But yes, we are still sense of all. We are expecting to deliver a report in January. We also now currently working, and today is, say, our informal internal deadlines of closing the inventory down, and we have to deliver it internally to the analysis group at the end of this month. Is all kinds of workshops with 2,000 young people involved about what are your future dreams. So, and here we look at what is the destination, where's the location of the dreams, what kind of ways you want to live, what kind of accommodation, what kind of lifestyle, what kind of obstacles. And of course, during this process, the idea was we do the workshop on location, but it is of course transferred to online with COVID-19, but we have put an extra question in it. What is the impact of COVID-19 on the dreams and obstacles? And also now, we are now turning it down, but our first insight is that there are differences between member states in the perceived impact of COVID-19 on dreams and obstacles, but yes, it's still work in progress, but that is something we are now working on. And we hope also this will also be presented in January. So that is something which we're working on. And after we have done this work, we will confront these outcomes with future workshops with stakeholders in these regions. And this will we do in the beginning of next year. And we will probably have a conference, and it's clearly, its idea was it was be on site, but probably will be online, or we don't know yet. In a conference on futures, rural futures in Turku. Next slide, please. Next to this foresight analysis, we do the facilitating rural newcomers, new entrants to farming, and that is also next slide. And therefore, we have done some analysis of reports and literature, and this is being delivered to the European Commission. And we are now in the process of doing case studies. So 30 case studies in I think 10, 11 member states on rural newcomers, on new entrants into farming, on successes. And of course, this is now on the way. And of course, COVID-19 will be addressed by many people in this. So, but the idea is that we look at promising practices, not about case studies on where things go wrong, but where you can see seeds for success or seeds for improvement of this, getting new rural newcomers and new entrants into farming going. And also here we will confront this with other regions, with stakeholders, and compare the outcomes. Next slide, please. And then we go the tools to provide access to land. This is the third element. Next slide, please. And here we are now in the midst of analysis of legal policy arrangements, in which we are now in work in the general. We try to get for 28 member states and this is, for most of them we have it already, and the other ones we are waiting for the last results to come in, and we will analyze this next month. And then we will look at 8 specific arrangements to look about legal and policy arrangements in member states in relation to access to land. We're also working now on analysis of land holdings, and that looks at prices, capitalization of cap payments, all kinds of how land holding is moving, and that is something we're also working in, and we will have in a month or so 2 expert workshops on one on policy arrangements and one on land holdings. And we are also at this moment, and we are also in the process of delivering it, an impact on what are current innovative practices, and after we have analyzed current innovative practices, we work on all kinds of novel innovative practices. The difference between those legal and policy arrangements is that there the authorities are key, and in these innovative practices is all kinds of community organizations, civil society, NGOs, all kinds of more bottom-up practices which are developed. And of course here, of course, in your network you need governments involved often, because they can be a good help. But it's balanced way, and also here the outcomes will be discussed in all kinds of focus group discussions. Next slide, please. And that shows, I think, the policy contributions. And here we will go with a good practice guide and handbook. We will discuss policy approaches in certain regions. We look at what are the lessons learned, and of course we will look at potential synergies with other projects. Next slide, please. And of course the communication dissemination takes place, like the webinar we are now on, but also many face-to-face actions and media. And we will have 2 international conferences. I hope October 2021 must it be in Budapest next year. So we have a little hope that it can take place. This is small mistakes in my slide. And we will have publications, etc. I think this is more or less it, isn't it? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cortales, for this very interesting introduction. Are there any questions already at this point? Feel free to ask.
Yes, Sebastian Lasnik speaking here. I would have a question. You spoke about the case studies, and you mentioned rural newcomers and rural successors. Could you give maybe a short example what's behind the rural newcomer and the rural successor in your particular cases?
A successor is often the traditional way of you're raised on a farm, and you wanted to start a farm just like your parents did. That is mostly the successor. And a rural newcomer can also be outside of farming, that you are from an urban background and you start to make a livelihood in rural areas, but not as a farmer. So I think that is the main difference. And you have a new entrant into farming is someone who is not raised at a farm, but just start farming. I think also the newbie network also work on those kinds of issues.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? All right. I hope, Andres Visser, you're ready. You will talk about the Horizon 2020 NEWBIE project. The floor is yours.
Yes, I'm ready. Do you hear me all? Good morning, everybody. I hope you can see my screen as well. I just shared it. Is this the case?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Yes, okay. Because, well, I'm going to tell you very briefly in 10 minutes something about the NEWBIE project. It's a 4 years project. We're already in our 3rd year. It will not be possible to share all the results, but I will highlight some things. The NEWBIE thematic network. Here you see the website, newbieacademy.eu. Please have a look at our website. You will find a lot of information there. What we focus on mostly is the fact that we are in Europe really in need of generation renewal in agriculture. This is a picture of the average farmer's age in the different countries over Europe of farmers over 55 years. And there are countries in which we have about 70% of the people of the farmers over 55 years. So we need new farmers, and that is not always as easy to follow up a farm as it used to be. So in our thematic network, we really focus on stimulating innovation and entrepreneurship in European agriculture through the support of new entrants in developing new sustainable farms. And we already had a small discussion about terminology. We look at new entrants as being both newcomers to agriculture as successors. So people taking over a farm from their family, or people moving in from outside agriculture. So that's slightly different from the ruralization project. And these newcomers are people from outside agriculture and successors inside. So it's really about renewal in agriculture. And what our main focus is, we want to develop a network on new entrants. If you go to our website, you could subscribe there as well, become a member, and you get all kind of information. And in that way, we build our network. But we also try to collect the state of the art on new entrants moving into agriculture, so including barriers, bottlenecks people experience to get into agriculture. And we look, of course, in solutions and inspiration. We like to facilitate the development and dissemination of new business and entry models. And also we like to develop new tools in co-creation with all relevant stakeholders, enabling people to take over farms in the future. And of course, finally, active dissemination of this knowledge and practice. I have a part of something in my screen, so I can't see all of my slides. I try to read around it. Why do we want to work on new entrants? Well, both successors, also people taking over a family farm, but maybe have worked outside or had an education in another line of work, and newcomers are very important for the ongoing vitality and competitiveness of the agricultural sector. They often bring new skills to the agriculture, new networks, maybe even capital they developed or gained in other sectors outside agriculture. And what we see is they bring a lot of innovation. And I think that is very important in developing our agriculture sustainable. We do this with the following partners. We have 9 partners in 10 countries. John Moriarty from Chegask from Ireland will present later on a case study about resilience from NEWBIE. So we work in 9 countries, but of course we want to spread our knowledge all over Europe. Maybe some results. I can't go in depth into all the results, but we did an extensive survey on barriers and possible solutions of people wanting to move into agriculture. And sorry, my webcam is closed, I see. And these are the main, so access to land, access to capital, probably all familiar to you all, access to labor, access to markets, access to knowledge, and access to networks. This survey is available on our website. There's a report, you can find it there. Maybe take out something specifically. We also looked in how newcomers, so people moving from outside agriculture into agriculture, finance their business. And we see actually 3 types of financing of these newcomers. So self-funding, they buy or start partnerships. External funding, we see a lot of crowdfunding or customer financed, or they even find investors buying their farms. And we see a third model that is share farming or partnerships with landowners, and also joint venture models. What we did and what we are still doing is all these kind of new ways of getting access to land or access to capital, or good examples of that. We put them in practice descriptions targeted towards new entrants or new farmers. So there are 2 pages of very condensed information based on practice on this specific topic. So for example, access to land with the Farm Related Land Fund, or access to land through the Land Mobility Service. All these kind of practice descriptions you can find on our website. And beside that, we will develop, and I think there are about 45 now, around 120 practice abstracts, which you can find in the EP Agri website. If we look at the business models of newcomers, we see a lot of differentiation going on. So niche products and markets, see a lot of organic farming, short change, direct sale, alternative food networks like community supported agriculture and co-production. And we see also a lot of on-farm diversification in relation to pedagogical trajectories, social farming and recreation. But I think the main point on all these models of newcomers into agriculture is that we see that they are all locally bound and highly socially integrated. What we also do is we follow around 90 case studies in NEWBIE. There's already the first report available on the website. So in every country we have 10 case studies. We look into their business models and so on, what kind of hurdles they experienced, how they solved it, these kind of things. If you go to our website, you will find a map, which you see here on the left, and there you will find at the moment there are about 71 examples, so case studies on the website with a description of the farm, also a short movie of the entrepreneurs explaining on their activities and how they started, how they overcome hurdles and these kind of things. So really pay a visit to that website, because there's a lot of inspiration for a lot of young people who started recently their farms. Looking at the future, we still have 1.5 years to go. We are going to develop, and still already working on it, we're going to develop a toolkit which will be a web-based design in which we will gather all available information on access to land, access to capital, and all these topics already mentioned. It will be present on a website in the easy-to-search database, and it will be on different levels. So information gathered which will be relevant to all within Europe. Then we have a country entrance, so information prioritized on a specific country, what is relevant for that specific context and situation, in the national language, and other relevant English info is placed there. We will have inspirational case studies and stories like I showed in the previous slide. Specifically developed material for partner countries based on analysis on the available material in every country and the white spots in that. And of course, policy recommendations. So this is the main object we will work on in the coming 1.5 years. Maybe walking ahead on the discussion later on in this meeting, we haven't done research on it, but from our different partners we get well, some reports on the impact of COVID-19. And because what we see in the business models of newcomers, which are mainly based on short change, direct sale, and diversification, they are really locally bound. We get reports on an increase in buying directly food and food products from these kind of farms. So they get an increase even in their business model. They're doing quite well. We also see that there are some stories on farms that quickly develop or open up new markets or products, often based on the context they have in their networks. They also often have extensive networks of customers, and they are able to quickly develop new kind of products and markets. And what we also hear from new entrants is that in discussions with their customers, they experience that there is more support for these kind of farming systems at the present situation that are based on circular, organic, and locally oriented farming systems. It seems that the COVID crisis seems to make people more aware of the vulnerabilities of the global food system. So well, one of the questions, and we really would like to go into that somewhat more in depth in the future, is the question whether new entrants and their business models are more flexible and maybe open to challenges and opportunities. Well, that's what I wanted to say briefly in these 10 minutes, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Andres, for this wonderful, very wonderful presentation. Are there any questions for Mr. Victor? All right, if there are no questions left, I would suggest we move on to another Horizon 2020 project. It's called RURITAGE and will be presented by Claudia De Luca, the project coordinator of the RURITAGE project. Please, Claudia.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can hear you well. Thank you, Claudia.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
So, sorry, I was kicked out somehow, but so I didn't hear anything after my presentation. But I hope there were no questions. Go ahead, Claudia. Thank you.
Thank you. I just have a question because I was just listening, of course, to the presentation before me, and I was wondering, we now have the merged presentation. So the project presentation, let's say, with the main focus on the COVID part, and then the resilience case presentation that will be presented by Alberto from PM. So I was wondering if, are you expecting us to do all of it now, or if I should just present the project and then Alberto will join the second session? I don't know, maybe if somebody from the organizer, from Consulta can...
We are following the agenda as we send you per email.
Sorry?
We're following the agenda as we send you per email, and your speeches are separated. So I got to speak later on. If that's okay.
So they go separately. Alberto will speak later on. Yeah, sorry. So it was my fault that I got that we had to do a joint presentation. So, but it's fine. So Alberto will join after. Yeah, sorry for that. Thanks, Sira, for sharing the screen. Hi, everybody. So I'm Claudia De Luca. I'm working at the University of Bologna, the Department of Architecture that is leading this RURITAGE project. You can go for the next slide. And what I will be presenting you today, so I will not exactly focus on the project, let's say, objective and outcome. We are already in the third year of the project and a lot of activities took place, but I will actually focus on an initiative that a couple of initiatives actually, that we launched linked to the COVID-19 pandemic in the last months, specifically a call for actions that we had and some brainstorming that we did with our consortium. And I will try to, let's say, present you some first thoughts on possible action that we do see for the future, let's say, for a vision of the future of rural areas. Then in the second part then of this webinar, and sorry for my misunderstanding on this, there will be the Olus PM, that is one of our role models, so one of our case study, will be presenting one of the resilience practice that we collected during this call for action. Next slide, please. So what is RURITAGE? As the project that anticipated me in this webinar, RURITAGE is funded by H2020 under a call in 2017 that was about cultural heritage as a driver for sustainable growth. The project started in June 2018 and will end in May 2022, so it's a 4-year project. It's around 10 million of budget, so it's quite big, and you can see it also for the number of partners. We are 38, coming from 19 countries around the world, so we also have case study and partners outside from Europe. And it's at the time the only project that was funded on the topic of rural regeneration. Concerning these, please go on the next slide. Can you move on to the next slide? Thank you. So concerning these, our objective, and in this we are a bit, we have a different approach, let's say, of the project that we just heard. So our objective is really to work with rural communities, and we are working on, let's say, rural growth and regeneration, let's say, enhancing and working on local natural and cultural heritage in a very wide, let's say, conception and meaning. So to us, heritage is not just the built heritage, the built cultural heritage, is not just the natural heritage recognized as such, so let's say park or protected area, but it's basically also all the intangible heritage that cross rural areas, so all the tradition, the artisan, art and festivals, so everything that is also boosting rural development. And what we have tried to do within the project was to identify 6 drivers that we called systemic innovation areas, so these SIAs, to basically try to codify a paradigm for rural regeneration. And these 6 drivers are pilgrimage, rural food, migration, art and festival, resilience, and landscape. What does it mean? That we believe that for sustainable growth, rural territories and communities should go a bit beyond the, let's say, the narrative of agriculture within rural areas, but should really embed a much broader sense of community and a much broader driver also of job creation and economic growth. Within these 6 areas, we identified 13 role models. So let's say 13 good practices that somehow, to our understanding, embed this systemic innovation area within their practices. Among these 13 role models, to give you some example, you can find all of these, of course, in our website, all the presentation of the role models. And so, for example, for the pilgrimage part, we have as a role model the Camino de Santiago in Spain. So just, I think this is a very good and explanatory example. For rural food, we have very different cases coming from Colombia for the coffee production to Puglia with the farmers' dinner. So what they call this connection with rural and urban. On migration, PM is one of our role models, and the other one is actually situated in Lesbos. And the idea is how to use local natural and cultural heritage to also integrate and to repopulate area through migrants' arrival in this case. The Art and Festival is also embedding several SIAs. And what we have here is a big festival in a very, very small town in Hungary, in Visegrad. That they do this middle-age festival, but they also managed to make these sustainable and out of seasonality. So they managed to build upon this festival and to create, let's say, a whole year events. On resilience, we have different cases. We work both on resilience to natural disasters. So we do have Iceland and their case that is really about natural disaster. We also work on earthquake with Crete and Marche region in Italy, but mostly we intend resilience as community resilience. So really the capacity of the community to, let's say, respond to any kind of crisis that could be, that they could face. And the final one is landscape, and on landscape we have very different cases and very nice one on how they manage with an integrated landscape management to basically build and to repopulate the community. They are coming from Ireland. We do have a case in Westbeak in Ireland, the part of Galway. And then we have a case that is cross-border among Spain and Portugal with the Douro River. And finally, we have a case in Turkey. So what are we doing with these 6 SIAs is basically to try to extract, let's say, these good practices from the role models and then to replicate those in some territories. So we have 6 replicators that are now, they co-developed, their action plan last year together with their stakeholders, and they are now in the phase of the co-implementation. So they're really implementing their plans. Everything is available in our website, so I really invite you to have a look there at what they're doing. The action are really different. So they're working on pilgrimage, they're working on migrants integration, they are developing festival. It's really nice, I have to say. Ended their action plans in February. And I mean, as you all know, in March, everything started. Actually, one of our replicators is in Italy, and we have been the first European country that was hit so hard. So maybe we got before the others the idea and the impression that this was going to be long, and it was not just, and it was not fast, let's say. So we started to, and of course, a lot of activities were stopped because most of our implementation take place with the people and the community. So people couldn't meet. Rural area, the Wi-Fi connection also, to do everything remote was not easy. And in most of the case, there's also an issue of digital literacy. So what we tried to do at that moment, and you can go to the next slide, was to open was to open a call for action. So we launched a call in our website to basically try to understand what rural communities were doing around the world to face this global pandemic. So there were a lot of information about what cities were doing, what were the solidarity initiatives in the city, but not that much about rural areas. So we decided to launch this call. The call was open from March to May. You can go to the next slide. We received 66 actions from 17 countries, and we tried again to categorize them with this narrative of the systemic innovation area that we got. And you can see here from the graph on the right that we cover all the SIA. So what we did with that, and you can go to the next slide, during the General Assembly, that as you can imagine was held online at the end of May, we did a brainstorming with our partners to try to understand, again, next slide, please, to try to understand which are the main challenges and opportunities presented by the actual crisis in rural areas. And we tried again to use the narrative of these 6 lines, these 6 SIA, to understand for each SIA which were the main challenges and opportunities. And also which are the main challenges and needs of their local stakeholders and what we could do within RURITAGE to support them. And at the very end, so which were the ideas that also our partners had in mind. As I was saying before, we are quite a lot, so a lot of ideas came out from this brainstorming. And from there, we started to ask ourselves, you can go to the next slide, and this was also really, let's say, really highlighted by the press. So are we in front of a rural renaissance? There are some ideas that actually social restriction and lockdown could have reverted citizens' priority, leaving space for a rural renaissance. So social distancing, the lack also of natural spaces and green spaces in cities, and also the possibility of smart or remote working could actually leave urban inhabitants, urban jewels, to move to, let's say, more natural environments and to rural areas. This is, let's say, a feeling that was starting from the very beginning, at least in Italy, it was raised from the very beginning, even in the press. So we started to reflect upon this. And we are now developing, we already published a scientific paper on this. You can go to the next slide, please. And we are now starting to reflect about some, let's say, policy recommendation that we could draft from it. This will be collected in a vision paper that will be a deliverable of the project and will be published at the end of October. So far, what we are thinking about, and again, this is really in line with the overall, let's say, RURITAGE approach, is that despite the recognition, of course, of the of the incredible link of the net action at rural area, we are actually claiming for a further and stronger integration of rural development policies. And what we would like to see for a very also different narratives of rural areas in the future is a further integration of natural services and capital. And here we list some of the main European policies of this. So, of course, the Common Agricultural Policy, but also the New Green Deal and the Biodiversity Strategy that are just released. Also, like how culture can be better integrated, we see that some of our SIAs are basically built on community initiative on culture, and this should be also much better integrated into the smart specialization strategies that regions are now developing. On the other side, education and training is crucial. If we think about the COVID lockdown, one of the main issues, as I was saying before, the digital literacy. So there should be a better knowledge to overcome digital and entrepreneurial knowledge divides. And also there, not to raise awareness, and also as NEWBIE was saying, for business support. And last, of course, accessibility, both digital and physical. So there should be better funding for transport, mobility, and internet infrastructure. We also thought, and if you can go on the next slide, at national level, so let's say national and regional level, again, there should be a need, of course, to guarantee access to basic services, but also funds for infrastructure. And again, here we think quite much about the digital infrastructure. There should be an inclusive process, so leave no one behind. The basic digital literacy is now needed in all rural areas if we really want them to regenerate, and to grow. And there should be, there could be regional priorities linked to the EU funds, and that could work in the direction of the drivers that we identified. So enhancing cultural and natural heritage, local tradition, arts, artifact and festival, social inclusion and community resilience. And last, at local level, next slide, sorry, in line with the leader approach also, we think that there's a strong need to promote local resources that include but are not limited to local food production. Working on diversification, so that's something that in our replicators they're really doing in their action plan. The role of local administration is crucial in the process. They should properly plan together with the stakeholders future development to repopulate aging areas, and always depopulating one. Avoiding unplanned gentrification issue, that there's a big theme there about tourism, second home, the so-called staycation now, that could contribute to rural regeneration, but should be carefully planned, not to lead to gentrification issue in rural area. And this could be done also including a participatory process to integrate local stakeholder needs and inhabitants' expectation. That's basically all. As I was saying, the next slide, you will find these in a deliverable that will be published at the end of October, but you can already find all the action that we're collecting in our websites. In the next slide, you have the useful resources. So our deliverable, the link to the resilience in practice, and the link to the paper that we developed on the COVID-19 pandemic effect in rural area. That's it from my side. I'm sorry if I was a bit long. And then, I will leave it to Alberto later on in the other session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia, for the wonderful contribution. Does anyone else have any contribution to this part or any questions for Claudia? All right, if there are no further questions, we move on to the next part of our session today. Sebastian Lasnik, Chairman of the Rural Youth Europe, will speak on the impact of COVID-19 on young people in urban and rural areas. Sebastian, please.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Can you all hear me very well and see me very well? Because I'm doing a speech, not a slideshow. So I hope you can see me as well. Super. Perfect. All right. Well, okay, I was going to start. First of all, thank you so much for actually inviting us to speak to you guys today from a very practical point of view, from an organizational point of view, on the impact of COVID-19 on rural youth and young farmers. Breaking boundaries and building bridges is actually the mission of Rural Youth Europe, which is a Europe-wide organization which functions as an umbrella organization for around 500,000 grassroots members all around Europe in about 20 countries with 23 member organizations. So this is actually what Rural Youth Europe is all about. And our main focus is to educate and train people and create awareness of rural and social issues. Also, we actively encourage rural population and industry, and also focus very strongly on employment with respect to these points. And of course, we support the development of rural youth organizations in general. How do we do this? We are mainly activity focused and based, so we do international events where we basically provide training and education on this topic for all our grassroots members. And of course, we also lobby and highlight the problems and needs of rural youth and young farmers to focus on this point and to get attention basically also on international European bodies, but also on national bodies. So this is what actually Rural Youth Europe does, so you understand a little bit better the next points I'm going to highlight with respect to the topic, meaning what the impact we believe COVID-19 has on rural youth and young farmers in particular. My name is Sebastian Lasnik, so I'm the chairman of Rural Youth Europe, and yeah, I'm going to address a few points. We have heard already some very interesting outcomes from the H2020 projects. We are also part of one H2020 project starting next year, so we are very curious also to work in these fields more in detail. So what do we believe are the impacts actually of COVID on young people in rural areas? In short terms, we think, or I believe, that the impact is quite tremendous, and especially on rural youth, but of course also on youth in general. So rural youth, I think, is facing big challenges in these special times during the pandemic. And I'm going to highlight a few points now where we think especially rural youth and young farmers are affected very strongly. Well, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting all parts of society and the livelihoods around the globe. There's no discussion about this. It is though worth recognizing actually that the disadvantaged segments of our population, like rural young women and men, are actually much bigger, we believe, than compared to other segments of the population. And this is because of, I would say, the following reasons we see. The first point I want to highlight is education. So in rural areas, the education, vocational education and training systems may already be disadvantaged by the underdevelopment or lack of certain services like technology, like infrastructure. We all know those kind of things. And actually, the lockdown or the closure of the education and learning facilities may actually leave behind millions of rural youth, we think, around the globe, but also in particular in Europe, just because they own the difficulties of the context they're living in, paired already with the difficulties in accessing technologies for distance learning and such. So we believe that education is a big disadvantage, or it's actually facing a huge impact due to the COVID-19 situation. And that's actually what we also can see through our organizations Europe-wide, that education was always also within the organization a big part of the activities, but now it seems to be even more important because they see from the governmental systems that there is a big gap and lack of education due to the situation coming around. The second part I want to highlight, where we see especially rural youth and young farmers are facing quite difficulties due to the pandemic, is employment, youth employment. We know already that roughly 1 out of 6 young people stopped working during the pandemic and might not get easily back into the system, but this is not a number tackling the rural aspect. I think the rural aspect with this is even stronger. And as we could already see in the first presentation today, that also the GDP gap in rural areas and urban areas is quite big. And now with this impact of the pandemic, we actually could see that this gap might potentially even increase. We also could see some positive development there. For example, when it comes to the recognition of food production and local food and the appreciation of farmers. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So education and employment are 2 main points where we see that they are having quite an impact on our members and especially rural youth. The third point I would like to highlight is quite an interesting one because it's in general a big disadvantage or a big deal, but I think due to the COVID we found some very interesting things going on there. Is I would call it the rural voice. Well, in general we think that the rural voice or the voice of rural youth in particular is often unheard and not consulted enough. Although we definitely see increasing recognition that of youth participation and that we got involved more and more in decision-making processes, not only because of very good platforms like the European Youth Forum. I know we're going to hear a presentation later today from them as well. Is giving rural youth also a stage where they could like basically raise their voice. But we also could see that during the COVID-19 pandemic, that very often we got the feeling that the participation in such decision-making processes were often very symbolic. So we felt, okay, we are there, we are invited, but we are not really heard. We are more there as a in a very active role, which was very frustrating actually to some extent. So making rural youth voices heard, I believe, or our organization actually believes, during the COVID-19 pandemic could be difficult, given the underdevelopment in certain areas. Yeah, in long story short, we just think that the dialogue and certain decision-making processes is often not very good, or not to the extent where we would think that rural youth should be heard. Also, when we think about certain policies which were already mentioned today, like the biodiversity policy or the farm to fork strategy from the European Union, where we believe in general, which are very good and important, tackling quite big challenges ahead in the future. But then on the other hand, that even the word young farmer or rural youth is not even mentioned once in there, shows us actually that this is not the way where we believe where we should be are, and especially that young farmers and the rural youth has to carry out these strategies, has to put them into practice. So I think there is still quite a gap in there, and especially within the last month, we could see that this kind of gap has become even bigger. There's 2 other points I would like to mention where we think the impact has been quite big, and with the communication or conversations we had with our member organizations, and also with grassroots members really living in rural areas and young farmers. There is one particular point, which is gender. We could strongly see, and I think you all will agree, that the impact of COVID-19 is not gender neutral. I mean, especially in rural areas, we know that the gender gap or the equality between women and men is still not where we think it should be. But disease outbreaks increase women's role, or actually affect them in particular much more, and especially they are young women, we think, like with duties of caring for the elderly, making sure ill family members are getting the care they need, and also for children and siblings who are out of school because of the lockdowns. And we think that this has affected young women even more than before. So and therefore we also think that with a secondary outbreak, or with a second wave, this could cause even more tremendous impacts. So we could see that this is actually a topic which was very relevant in our organizations, and very actively tackled as well, and raised the awareness of it. And slightly linked with it, the last point I would like to mention, but also in general a very important point, is mental health. So we could see over the last years there was quite a positive process going on, how mental health was tackled. Also, we tried to tackle this in our events very strongly, because we could see, especially in rural areas and with rural youth and young farmers in particular, that mental health was a big deal. But now we got the feeling throughout the pandemic, because of the usual disadvantages between urban and rural lifestyle, within the combination of the COVID-19 pandemic, mental health has become even a more important topic, and was quite also visible in our member organizations' activities over the last month, over the last years in general, but over the last month we could see in particular that there was a lot of things going on when it comes to caring and taking care of the society, or the rural communities, and making sure everybody is doing all right. So in general, I know we're going to talk a little bit more later, and we're going to hear about best practices and how organizations deal with this, and what are the new opportunities within this pandemic. And there definitely are, and we could see so many positive things going on. And I just want to highlight a few findings and characteristics where we could see how quick rural youth and rural youth organizations are able to adapt to such a, well, once in a lifetime event, so to say. And some characteristics were actually the creativity. I mean, this is something I think youth has in general, the creativity and the speed to adapt to the situation. And in particular, we could see that the fact in rural areas, this caring about the community and charity and supporting each other, to say it in short words, was a huge part of the online activities, or the also on-spot activities they did over the last month. These new ways of addressing and engaging with youth in the rural areas, using technologies and such, was quite a big thing. And also to see how some organizations completely restructured themselves within a few weeks, just to be able to adapt to the new challenges ahead. And also to see this kind of solidarity within the organizations, also, so that the grassroots members basically stood up and say, okay, we show solidarity to keep the organization going instead of, you know, pointing out that this and that activity might not might not be the same as it was years before. So these were kind of very interesting characteristics and findings we could see throughout this many and various activities they did throughout the last month during the lockdown and the pandemic. And one thing I want to point out in particular, and then I'm going to finish my speech already, is the appreciation for farmers. We could see that this was something very, very interesting going on, and it was already mentioned as well before in other presentation that the local aspect of food production and direct sale and direct marketing has become, or has gotten quite a huge appreciation in general, I would say. That food got a completely different value, I think, in our whole society. And I think we have to push this momentum now even further, because this is what we were actually shouting out for many years already. So I think that the whole society in general saw how important shops and the agricultural aspect of rural areas are for the good of all, a good of everybody. So I think this is something we should even push forwards. Well, to conclude, we had education, we had employment, we had the rural voice, we had mental health and the gender aspect. And then also the very positive side that we could see how quick rural youth actually developed new strategies and new ways to cope with the situation. But in conclusion, as governments and development partners take steps to address the economic and social effects of COVID-19, they should not allow to reversal the should not allow actually a reversal of the rural progress achieved in recent years. We should actually use this to push it even further, I think, because now many people of our society also understood how important the rural areas and jobs and the agricultural part of it is. So I know we have big challenges like climate change, future food production, migration movement, and such in the future ahead of us. And I think, and we as Rural Reserve actually strongly believe that only very well educated young people from the rural side with an open mind will be able to tackle the challenges in the rural areas, in the agricultural field, to make these areas also very livable and very attractive in the years to come and in the decades to come. So this is actually the conclusion. I would say that we have to focus even more and to raise the voice even more. Although, unfortunately, these points I highlighted before are very much affected nowadays. So I also invite you, as the speakers did before, to reach out to us on Facebook. You can search on Rural Youth Europe and also look on our Facebook, on our homepage, what we do and what we are, how we cope with the situation. And I'm curious actually now to hear some best practice stories also from other organizations in the presentations to come. So thank you very much that I could speak to you today, and I hope to stay in touch, and I'm happy to answer some questions if you have some. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sebastian, for highlighting these very important aspects. Are there any questions for Sebastian Lesnick? All right, if there are no more questions, we will move on. Nikita, are you ready?
Yep, I'm ready.
Wonderful. Please tell us more about the impact of COVID on young people in urban and rural areas.
Okay, so I also don't have slides, so I hope that you can see me. So first of all, thank you to the organizers for having me today. And for those who are unfamiliar with the European Youth Forum, so we are an international NGO and the largest platform of youth organizations in Europe. And today I was asked to present a little research project that we worked on together with the ILO and the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and a couple of other partners. Essentially, we conducted a global survey to analyze the impacts of COVID-19 on young people in kind of the direct aftermath of lockdowns. So this survey was open from around mid-April to mid-May, and we received over 12,000 responses from 18 to 29-year-olds in over 112 countries. The survey looked at the impacts on employment, education, mental health and well-being, as well as social activism of young people in different parts of the world. The study finds that the impacts of the pandemic on young people are really systematic, they are deep, and they are also disproportionate compared to other age groups. It has been particularly hard on young women, what we call younger youth, so that means between the ages of 18 to 24. And also that it hits young people in poorer countries of Europe the hardest. So unfortunately, the survey was not broken down in terms of whether young people were living in urban or rural areas. And it is, before I go into the sort of findings, I do want to kind of acknowledge that it is primarily representative of kind of educated youth who have access to the internet. So it is a more privileged group, let's say, and this is also a result of the fact that of the methodology used, we had to use kind of an online survey because of the social distancing rules, of course. But I think that it's important to bear in mind in terms of the findings, the results that are quite stark, is that I think it poses some really important questions about how much worse off young people who are more difficult to reach or who are maybe more disadvantaged are. So in terms of the impact on employment, so we heard from Sebastian earlier, 1 in 6 young people reported that they have stopped working since the onset of the pandemic. So it's really highlighting the dramatic impact that the pandemic is having on youth labor markets. And this is really a consequence of young people often being the first out during layoffs, and also having non-standard work and precarious contracts that are much easier to kind of terminate. Young workers have also seen a reduction of 23% in their working hours, which averages to about 2 hours per day. And as a result of these cuts in working hours, 40% of them have seen a reduction in their income. And in these cases, it is young people who have kind of lower levels of education who are at greater risk. We asked young people if they are benefiting from their government's policy measures like income support that are intended to address the impacts of the crisis on the labor market right now. And what we see is that unfortunately, they are not reaching the most vulnerable. They're actually much more likely to reach young people who have remained in employment, and particularly young workers who are in occupations associated with higher levels of formal education. So this is a result of this support often being conditional on being employed. And it also reflects existing gaps in access to social protection that we see for young people in Europe. So often young people aren't able to access certain forms of support, for example, housing benefits because of their age, or because they haven't accrued enough like work hours or work experience. In terms of the impact on education and training, we've across the world, the closure of education and training facilities has affected over 73% of students. And despite the efforts to ensure the continuity of education, 65% of young people are reporting learning less since the onset of the pandemic. So as a result of that, half of students are anticipating that their studies are going to be delayed, which is going to have an impact in terms of the transition from education to employment. And the fact that there are fewer jobs available in the labor market because of the pandemic also raises some concerns about the kind of future that awaits these students when they do graduate. And then bearing in mind, again, some of these issues in terms of them not being able to access unemployment benefits, for example. Due to unequal access to ICTs in rural areas, I think it's fair to assume that rural youth are more likely to experience barriers in accessing long distance kind of learning opportunities, which I think was something that was kind of echoed by Sebastian earlier. But on the positive side, what we are seeing is that about half of students around the world are finding or trying to seek out their own kind of new learning opportunities despite school closures. So that's a really good sign. Sebastian talked about how his members are seeing an impact on mental health and well-being, and that's definitely something that we saw echoed in the survey. We found that globally, 50% of young people are showing signs of anxiety and depression. No surprises, it is particularly kind of the case among young people who have lost their jobs or cannot continue their studies during this time. So I think it's really important to say here that the impacts that young people are facing today are the result of existing inequalities that have made them even more vulnerable during this pandemic. So in the EU, for example, over 1 in 4 young people were already at risk of poverty and social exclusion before the pandemic. Youth unemployment was already more than double the overall unemployment rate. I think, so this time last year, it was around 14.9%, and now it's getting closer to 17%. We're projecting that that is going to continue to increase as the year goes on. So for us, one thing that we think is really important is that, policymakers really heed the lessons from the aftermath of the 2008 economic crisis. Because what we saw there is that in order to respond to kind of high levels of youth unemployment, for example, governments started to relax labor legislation, and that led to young people ending up in, for example, these precarious jobs that they're now in today. And in fact, today, around 44% of young people are in temporary forms of work. So it's really important that our solutions are based on kind of lasting, long-term lasting change. And policies and investment in initiatives that provide quality education and education opportunities for young people that are inclusive and also of quality, so that young people avoid paying the price for today's crisis. I'm going to stop there, but but you can read the full results of this this survey, on the ILO's Decent Jobs for Youth website or on the European Youth Forum's social media account. So thank you.
Thank you, Nikita, for your contribution. These are very interesting aspects you addressed. Make sure to check out the website Nikita has mentioned. Are there any questions or other contributions from your side at this point? All right, if there are no more questions, we will move on to the next part of our webinar about the resilience stories. The question in this part is, will COVID-19 generate new opportunities in rural areas? The first speaker is Deidre de Willy from the Ruralization Project Network. Deidre, I cannot hear you at the moment. Please make sure to turn on your microphone. I'm sorry for the delay. We'll just have to wait for 1 or 2 minutes because of technical difficulties.
Hello? Sorry, can you hear me?
Oh, perfect. Now we can hear you.
Perfect, thank you. Hello, my name is Deirdre Dibley, and I'm here today to share with you my story on how COVID-19 has affected me and others like me. Next slide, please. I'm 22 years old and a final year student in University College Dublin, where I study animal and crop production. I grew up on a dairy farm in rural Ireland, and I have had an interest in farming from a very young age. The COVID-19 pandemic has undoubtedly been a challenge for me and all age groups, and unfortunately has caused a huge change in the day-to-day life as we know it for the foreseeable. For me, 2020 was set to be an extremely exciting year. Next slide, please. In January, I began my professional work experience, which is an essential component of my degree and must be undertaken before progressing to final year. I intended on carrying out my 30-week placement over a range of agricultural sectors that would provide me with the opportunity to further my knowledge in the different areas I will be studying for final year. Little did I realise the challenges I would face over this 30-week period to fulfil the requirements of the placement laid out by the college. Next slide, please. I travelled to New Zealand on the 23rd of January for my dairy placement with 8 other UCD students, and talks of the coronavirus spreading were just creeping in. Nobody knew how fast it was going to spread or the widespread disaster it was going to cause. I was milking 1,100 cows in the South Island of New Zealand, and I was delighted to get the opportunity to experience a grass-based system similar to Ireland's, but on a much larger scale, so I'd be able to apply it when I came home. But the first case of coronavirus was recorded in New Zealand a month later on the 28th of February. Next slide, please. It took a while to start spreading, but before the problem was too large to contain, the country closed its borders and went into lockdown on the 25th of March for a month. It was all a bit frightening at first. There was a lot of scaremongering happening. People were telling us to come home instantly or we might not get home at all, while others were saying it was too dangerous to travel through airports and we were better off staying where we were. No one was really able to give us any guidance in any direction, which was a bit daunting, but it was understandable because nobody knew the answers themselves. We eventually decided after days of debating we would stay until we were due to come home at the end of May. But during lockdown, I had to extremely restrict my movements. Before this, I had been using my weekends off to tour around the country, and I got great sightseeing done, but I had so much more planned to do. And then once lockdown was enforced, I couldn't go anywhere. I was given a letter from my farm owners to show to police if I was stopped on the roads during work hours to prove I was an essential worker. And on the farm, we had like the sanitization and social distancing measures were strictly enforced. It really took the joy out of the working environment for me, and I was really disappointed at how it had all worked out. But the virus peaked then at the beginning of April with 89 new cases being recorded in one day, and the lockdown measures came into effect and the numbers began to decline. Then the country began to slowly reopen and life went back to normal. Next slide, please. Except due to the borders being closed, this caused mayhem for us in our numerous attempts to get home, as once the plane stopped flying into New Zealand, it made it very hard for us to get a plane to fly us out of New Zealand. Our return flight for the 25th of May through Australia was cancelled 3 weeks in advance, so we booked another flight home for the 27th of May, and we had to pay an extra €760 along with the money we had already paid for our return ticket, but this was also cancelled with much less notice. We were given an option of travelling home through America and paying €1,500, but we decided we would stay on for another month and see if the flight situations would get any better, but they did not. Next slide, please. Our travel agent was great. She kept giving us options when she thought they might work, but our issue was to get out of New Zealand. The flights just kept getting cancelled. At this stage, the pandemic was getting worse in Australia, and flights going out of Australia were being cancelled also. We began to get desperate as the talks of the second wave were circulating, and places like China and other areas were being locked down for the second time. We were afraid if we stayed any longer, we wouldn't make it home on time, which starts in September. So we decided to bite the bullet and pay the extra money to come home via America, and we eventually managed to secure a flight for the 18th of July after the 2 extra months. We ended up paying the €1,500 to come home, which was almost the same price as we paid for our original ticket, which was a return ticket, and we are still awaiting a refund on our original flight. So it was an expensive journey home, but we were happy to get home safe and sound nonetheless. Next slide, please. While the uncertainty of how it was all going to work out at the time was very inconvenient, every cloud has a silver lining, and the extended stay gave me so many opportunities I would have missed out on if our flight in May had gone ahead. So I got to stay working on the farm for longer and got to see the cows being transitioned onto their outdoor winter feed, which doesn't happen at home. And I also got the opportunity to do a month's travelling when work on the farm quietened down. This made up for the time we had missed out on when our movements were restricted in April and May, and I got to do great things like go watch Super League rugby matches and go snorkeling and whitewater rafting, sand dune tobogganing and everything. It was an amazing experience in a beautiful country, and I don't regret staying on longer at all. I know I'm lucky to be one of the few my age who's in a fortunate position that I am not working in the retail or restaurant and hospitality industries, and for all of lockdown I was regarded as an essential worker. I was lucky to have such kind employers that guaranteed me a job and accommodation for the 2 extra months I had to spend in New Zealand. Otherwise, the whole sequence of events could have been much more stressful for me. Even now, life at home for me hasn't changed significantly. I can still get up and work on my farm with my family without having to adopt any of the virus regulations, which is great. But outside of this, the day-to-day life routine is much different. Meeting up with friends in the evenings has become increasingly more difficult as the guideline numbers allowed in the houses continues to get increasingly smaller. So it's very difficult to invite a few friends over and leave others uninvited. So we kind of find ourselves either only meeting with one friend at a time or not meeting at all. People are missing out on celebrating like major stepping stones in their lives, such as their 18th and 21st and graduations, as they can't celebrate them at home or in restaurants, pubs or nightclubs, which really is a shame. We cannot partake in pastimes such as going to watch matches, and even going clothes shopping is not as enjoyable as it once was. Online measures are brilliant alternatives to some of these pastimes for a short-term fix, but I think in the long term, living with the virus in a more social setting really needs to be focused on, as I know I and the majority of my friends would much prefer socialising face-to-face rather than over Zoom and online platforms. Next slide, please. Eventually, arriving home was an anticlimax. Don't get me wrong, we were delighted to get home, but we were coming back to lockdown measures that we hadn't been used to since May. We could not meet any family or friends for 2 weeks, and I quarantined at home for the 14 days in a room separate from my entire family, which was tough. I was lucky that I had a college project to keep my mind occupied, otherwise the days would have been so monotonous. And I was able to do some work on the farm without being at risk of spreading any virus to the rest of my family, which was good. But it still brought into perspective just how isolated farming in rural Ireland really is. Since getting out of quarantine at the beginning of August, I've been able to meet up with my family and friends in small groups, but it really just isn't the same. There's nothing much we can do together without going to public places, and we try to avoid this. And the main topic is always coronavirus. Next slide, please. My thoughts are now firmly based on going back to college and what will be ahead of me. We found out just this week that all our modules until Christmas will be online, and our Christmas exams will not be held in one big hall as has always been the case before this. The college atmosphere just won't be the same, as clubs and societies will not be able to run as normal, and even spaces in the library will be operating at a restricted capacity. I've been debating whether or not to move back up to Dublin for my final year, and it has been very difficult to conclude. However, I think it wouldn't be possible for me to carry out my education from home, as Wi-Fi speeds just wouldn't allow me to tune into live stream lectures or partake in group Zoom calls. While the situation is not ideal for being in final year, it's definitely the first years that are going to suffer. For me, going to college in Dublin was an extremely exciting but yet daunting experience. It was a new city I didn't know much about, and the college teaching methods and the college lifestyle is much different from being in secondary school, but it was made easier by meeting new people in the same boat as me and making new friends. It would be so much more difficult for these first years to make new friends now and adjust to their college lifestyle. New slide, please. As regards to the future, nobody knows what way things will go. I had previously planned on going to America on a J1 visa for the summer and then finding myself a job after graduating in September. But now, with the world entering a global recession, I find myself wondering, will there be any job vacancies in Ireland for the graduates of this year, 2020, never mind my year of 2021? So everything is very uncertain, and until an effective vaccine is rolled out for the widespread use, I think we will all unfortunately just have to live with this uncertainty. Next slide, please. I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my story with you today. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Deidre, for sharing your story with us. I'm sure we can all relate to some of the experience you addressed today. So our next story will be from Alberto Mussino, who is part of the RURITAGE project network. Alberto, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. Okay. I'm Alberto Mussino. I work in Piamonlus, is an NGO that provides assistance in Italy from refugees asylum seekers. Please, next slide. And we started 20 years ago. We opened a refugee centers, a shelter for victims of trafficking, and many of them are not in the big town, but in small village, because it's more easy to take care of people that have a problem in a local community than in a big town. But after some years that we do our work with the refugees and victims of trafficking, we start to understand that we can contribute to the local development of the town, on the village where we are working. And we start to speak with the mayor of the village, of the community, for look what are the needs of the place. And one of the main problems is that in our rural area, the people, the citizens are old, nobody work again the farm, as is difficult, and the depopulation is a problem. Then, please, next slide. And then we start to think that we can support our local community with the work of the refugees. And we start to train the refugees to work in the farm with the local farmer and to empower the territory. This was for me was idea that the migration can be a key of local development. Everybody when speak about immigration think that people come here in Europe for thief our money on our job. It's not like that. It's young people that is looking for a future, that is ready to work with us in our territory, and we can move in this way. COVID was a big example of this. During COVID, nobody can move. During COVID, nobody can do nothing. The lockdown was very, very hard in Italy. And who go in the farm to help the local farmer to plant, to work, to maintain our food sustainability in our territory? Nobody can do this. Please, you can put the next slide. And the CIRA is an Italian Confederation of Farmers, is a big organization, and we speak with them. And when we organize a group of refugees that with the permit of the government in safe way go to work with the farmer and continue to provide food for us, especially in the sector of the vineyard, that is the main economical resources of our territory. And this was good because without the refugees, nobody can go to work and continue to in the farm and continue to sustain our economy. Without this, was a big disaster. And this is a good example that if you join the interest of the refugees and with the interest of the local population, our territory can grow, can have a good result. And another important story is that because we make this agreement with the government to have the permit to send refugees to work with farmers, all the contact that we submit was on the office of the government, then regular contract with correct payment, not with exploitation, as many times can happen when immigrants work in the farm. Please, next slide. And even was good that because we know the needs of the farmer, we, in the time that the refugees stay in the center, we train them to learn how to work farm, how to work in the vineyard. Then when these boys go work in the farm are ready, know the work, and they take more experience. And many of them now can find a regular job, even because these experiences that start during the COVID. And next slide, please. And the local newspaper, they give us a lot of importance of this initiative. And I think that we can continue in this way, even in the next time, with or without COVID. I'm finished. This next thing, okay. This is our website, and you can check the information about our organization here on pmos.org. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your contribution. Please feel free to check out the websites who are stated here and also the social media channels. Our next story, resilient story, will be given by John Moriarty from TGAS, who will be giving a talk on behalf of the experience of Rory McGorian of the Kildenen Farm. Please, John, are you ready?
Yep, can everybody hear me?
I can hear you very well, thank you.
That's perfect. Yeah, so I'm going to briefly discuss the story of Rory McGorian. Rory is one of our newbie case studies here in Ireland. Andres would have mentioned those case studies earlier. There are 90 across the partner countries. And Rory is an organic salad leaf producer based in County Cork in the south of Ireland. So Rory had an interesting experience during COVID. So we'll go through that. So maybe just a little bit of background on Rory's story to start with. Rory started out about 10 or 11 years ago, growing a wide range of crops for farmers markets, for box schemes, where he supplied regular boxes of vegetables to customers on a weekly basis. He did a lot of direct selling, both on his website and in person, with people coming to the farm to collect their vegetables. And at the time, Rory was growing up to 15 crops. So it was very difficult for Rory and his wife to maintain 15 crops and a young family. So that led to Rory considering some changes. So next slide, please. About 7 years ago, Rory decided to change the direction of the business. He was looking at the crops he was growing and the reward he was getting for the labor he was putting in. So he noticed that some crops were more labor efficient and were actually returning a greater profit for the time that he was putting into them. So at the moment, Rory has consolidated the business and is growing producing 4 main products for sale. So he has kale, spinach, and rocket, and then his main product is a mixed salad bag, which accounts for 70% of his sales. So during the change in direction, Rory decided to move from selling at farmers markets and direct to customers, and started approaching local supermarkets who might be able to stock his produce. So at the beginning, he was traveling to supermarkets further away, and he enrolled in a course, a food production academy with the SuperValu chain, which is a pretty large chain here in Ireland. And this opened a range of new markets to Rory and allowed him to sell in the nearest SuperValus to him. So he now sells in 9 SuperValu stores in County Cork. So they're all within an hour and a half's drive of the farm. And as Rory describes it himself, the selling through the supermarkets has removed the time it takes him, or it was taking him, to do the sale. So he had to personally attend all the markets and be on the markets all day, maybe 3, 4, 5 days per week, and then had to return to the farm to do all the work on farm. So now the sales are being looked after by the chain. So it has given him a guaranteed market each week. There's a set order, and it fluctuates a little bit, but it's pretty steady, and it allows for better time management on the farm. So that's the biggest change that has happened on Rory's farm since he started out 10 years ago. So next slide, please. We have a video of Rory's farm where Rory himself describes the business. Hopefully it will work, and if not, we can leave it in the chat.
All right, we will try if the sound of the video works. Let us know if anybody can hear sound.
I can't.
All right, the sound is not working, unfortunately, due to technical difficulties. But I will put the link of the video in the chat for you to check it out later on if you're interested. John, you can continue with your presentation.
Okay, so instead of the video, maybe I'll just briefly try to describe Rory's farm and where Rory has come from as a new entrant. So Rory is what we would probably call a newcomer to farming. He was a printer by trade. He immigrated to Australia for a period, and on returning to Ireland, he took up work in Cork City. While he was working in Cork City, the farm where he's now based came for sale, and he bought the farm really for the house that was on the farm as opposed to the land. It was a place to live as opposed to a farm. So he developed the house and lived on the farm for a number of years, and the farm was leased to a local farmer. Then when the recession hit, Rory was made redundant from his printing job, and while at home in search of other work, Rory was looking at the land that he had and thinking, you know, there has to be a way of generating some income from the land. So he started initially growing some crops for use in the house, learning the skills, because Rory is a native of Dublin City, so did not have any farming experience, and gradually built up the skills and the confidence to begin to sell his produce, and it grew from there. So as I mentioned earlier, Rory was growing 15 crops at one stage, and then he embarked on that journey that brought him into the food academy and subsequently selling in the super value chain. So that's a short overview of Rory's story. Then if we come along to the opportunity that arose through COVID-19, so maybe a background on the COVID-19 restrictions in Ireland. They were, I think, similar for many of you. The restrictions were imposed in March. So that led to the closure of all the hospitality sector, really, restaurants, cafes, hotels and pubs. We were all working from home where possible, and only essential workers were allowed to travel and work on site. So next slide, please. So COVID-19 led to many changes in people's eating habits. I think, as I mentioned, the hospitality sector was closed down, so lunches at restaurants and that weren't happening anymore, so there's more meals at home. People then became more conscious of healthy eating because they were producing or preparing more of their own food, and in many cases food preparation became a pastime in households during the lockdown, and this led to people thinking about where their food comes from. And I think many people were asking themselves the question, where does my food actually come from? And there were many people were researching their food and putting more time into their weekly shop rather than grabbing food off the supermarket shelves. They were taking just a second to look at the labels and check the sources of their food. So next slide, please. there was a heightened public awareness and an increased interest in locally produced food. So there was a campaign was often quoted on social media to stay local and to support locals. So, you know, supporting the local shops and the local producers, and that in turn led to people staying within their own area, not traveling too far, which was in compliance with the restrictions. People became more conscious of choosing the healthy options, which Rory's products fit perfectly into. And also there was an increased demand for organic produce, which again, Rory's products and the Kildonan Farm range fitted perfectly into. So next slide, please. So for Kildonan Farm then, how has COVID affected Kildonan Farm? So as a food producer, it was an essential service, so continued to trade during the lockdown. While Rory doesn't have exact figures, he experienced at least a 25% increase in demand in the past 6 months. So from lockdown in March right through to now, his demand from the supermarkets is up at least 25%. And the good thing from Rory's point of view, and probably for all producers of similar products, is that this demand has remained. So for the past few months now, we've had reduced restrictions. We've been able to travel more. Restaurants and the hospitality sector has opened back up to a large extent. But Rory's demand for Rory's products, and especially the mixed salad bags, has remained constant throughout. So it looks like the changes that were made during the lockdown period, which would be the March to May period, in eating habits, have actually remained, and people have changed their overall habits. So next slide, please. So question many of you might be asking or thinking is, has Rory increased the output of the farm to coincide or to meet this extra demand? Now, Rory has told me he hasn't actually increased the area that's under each of the crops, but many years of work in terms of soil fertility has just come together, and the output from the same area has actually increased dramatically this year. So he's put a lot of work into soil fertility. He's experimented with a lot of organic compost, and he's tried a mushroom compost this year, which has made a huge difference. So while this increase in output wasn't as a direct reaction to the 25% increase in demand, both scenarios complemented each other very well on the farm this year. But I suppose it's also worthwhile mentioning that Rory wasn't able to speak today because today is one of his delivery days, but he's also extremely busy because he's had 3 times more rain this August and into the first week of September than he would normally have in that period. So while the increased output has been great, like all farming systems, there's the weather has an impact, and he's going through a little bit of a tough period at the moment, but he's very grateful for that increase in sales earlier in the year, which is helping him at this time. So next slide, please. Yeah. So I asked Rory what he felt made his business resilient during a a time such as COVID or any other crisis that might hit. So the strong points for the business he identified were that his produce is freshly produced and delivered. It's healthy, it's locally sourced, organically produced, and something that's been growing over the last number of years is the name has become familiar. The Kildonan Farm name is now known more widely, and it's growing all the time. So that's been a major factor for Rory, because as people identify with the name and they know they know that it's locally produced in the county. So that's been a major factor for the success of the farm. Next slide, please. Yep. So I'd like to thank you for the invitation to speak today. Also, I'd like to thank Rory for his input into this. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to take the time to speak himself, and he apologizes for that. And yeah, thank you for your time.
Thank you for sharing your story with us. Does anyone have any contribution or any questions for the 3 resilience stories we heard on the Ruralization, RURITAGE and NEWBIE project? Feel free to contribute your own experiences. All right, if nobody has to add anything, we will move on to the last part of the session. It will be about the impact of COVID-19 on European Union policies and its focus on youth and rural development policies. Our first speaker in this part will be Alexia Rubi, part of the European Commission for Agriculture. Alexia, the floor is yours.
Yes, good morning to all. Do you hear me well? Yes.
I hear you loud and clear.
Okay, great. And are you going to present my slides? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, we are.
So yes, good morning to all. Sorry, I'll ask you a second. Sorry for that. There's some background noise that I had to cut as much as possible. Yeah, I'm the policy. I work in the European Commission in the Department for Agriculture and Rural Development in the Research and Innovation unit. So I'm the policy officer in charge of following the projects that were here today, at least Ruralization and NEWBIE. One thing I wanted to say as a preamble is that I can really relate to the stories that have been told and see how difficult it is for young people to cope with the crisis because of all the opportunities it steals from them. Yeah, this is really a big problem, and I heard also the messages from the different presentations on the need to hear this and address it. However, I mean, under the Common Agricultural Policy, which is what I'm going to focus on today, there is a big focus on young farmers and young people. But the crisis response, the response to the COVID crisis, has not had a specific focus on any age group and has addressed the sector and rural areas as a whole. So I'm not going to be able to focus on anything on youth in particular, because this is not what we have done so far in this unprecedented moment of crisis and emergency. Next slide. I'm going to talk about 3 things: the emergency responses for rural development, then a little bit on recovery and resilience, but it's going to be very, very short because this is heavily debated at the moment. So there's not much that we are able to say beyond the conclusions of the Council in July. And then a look at wider policy initiatives that can encourage us to think about the long-term aspects and long-term lessons from this crisis. Next. So in terms of emergency response, you have here an infographic from the Council that I find quite useful to see in a nutshell what the response has been about when we talk about agriculture and rural areas. So really the main objectives have been to ensure that, avoid that we superpose a food crisis to the health crisis. That has been the big challenge for all our colleagues, and that has required a lot of adaptation, a lot of adopting a coordinated response in terms of EU regulation, ensuring the resources under the Common Agricultural Policy, so to really help cope and support the vital role of the farmers and the fishers and all the other provision of food. So we've had to adapt the existing programs to develop financial support and to help build resilience also, and facilitate the supply of food across Europe by first allowing essential workers to come in, including from the seasonal workers to go where they were most needed to ensure that the harvest could happen, and also to allow the some green lines and corridors for the trucks to actually move around and transport the food that we could think should come from local areas only, and that has had to come from local areas more, but today is essentially provided from also distances. So there has been several things done for farmers, first to help with the relief and the capacity to work with cash flow. There's been more advanced payments, both on direct payments and on some measures around rural development. There's been aid for private storage. There's been more time given for payment, cap payment applications, and then some provisions to help get access to loans and guarantees when people needed to borrow money for working capital. For example, the state aid rules have been extended to allow member states to really support the sector to the level that was needed. And there's been also an emergency assistance provided from the rural development funds. So I'm going to enter a bit more into details in the next slides. So this has required several things, allowing the member states to amend their rural development programs. They were allowed to, all sorts of flexibilities have been introduced, so they could implement new measures, they could shift funds from one measure to another, that the amendment procedures were shortened to the maximum while remaining within the legal legality, of what we have as constraints for these programs. There's been a new rural development measure developed. We have introduced some flexibility in the use of financial instruments under rural development, and other things that I've said already that were important. Next. So first, there are packages of measures that can be used already in the existing rural development programs, and the work was really to highlight that which these measures were and how they could be used by member states to cope with the crisis. So, for example, the measure that we have under rural development for basic services and village renewal, it can be used for investment in medical infrastructure, acquisition, adaptation of health centers and mobile health facilities. We have a measure called cooperation that can be used also to set up home delivery services, or cooperation in food supply and direct sales where this was not in place, or improving healthcare services as well. It is possible to use the leader also measure to develop basic services and healthcare facilities and the provision of these care services if this is part of the local development strategies. And then there were other measures like risk management, which allow also to support both the setting up of mutual funds, but when the mutual fund exists, also compensation for production losses in case of activation, so the EU can contribute financially to the compensation given to the farmer who subscribes to such an insurance risk management fund. And also advisory and farm relief services could be used to technical assistance. So there's been first a lot of awareness raising and some flagging of which measures were most suited to address the problem. Next. Then there's been this new rural development measure that has been created to ensure to allow for exceptional support. So it's an exceptional and temporary measure to cope with the liquidity problems of both farmers and agri-food SMEs affected by the crisis. This has been structured as a lump sum of maximum €7,000 per farmer and 50,000 per SME involved in processing, marketing or development of agricultural products. A lump sum means that it is provided to you provided you would justify that you're affected by the crisis, and you don't have to justify with invoices or things like that. Lump sum is provided per se. This, I mean, the administrative burden is quite light on these ones, and eligibility has been put on from 1st February 2020, so it could go backwards as well, and the payments are eligible until the end of this year. This has been limited to 2% of the current program contribution, the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development contribution to each rural development program. And from what we know, from early September, it's been taken up in around 15 rural development programs for a total amount of 260 million euros. And member states have had quite a margin of flexibility to use that one. So that was quite something. Yeah, next slide, please. There's been some adjustments also in the financial instruments with possibilities to support working capital that were already there. But in addition, there's been the possibility to provide standalone working capital loans or guarantees for loans for SMEs and to subsidize related interest rates. Of course, there are all sorts of details. These are very technical, and I'm not a specialist, but you can see that why this was needed, and it has been provided. And again, there are various types of flexibilities have been introduced so that approval procedures could be shorter, and the limit for supporting this loans has been set at higher at 200,000 euros. And while we're focusing on the cap here, say also that rural areas are also beneficiaries of the cohesion funds, and there's been the Corona Response Investment Initiative that has allowed the member states to use their cohesion funds, their remaining cohesion funds, because unfortunately, we are at the end of the programming period, so there's all the money that has already been committed cannot be used, but that was not fully committed, as we've allowed it to be shifted to actions that could help cope with the crisis, like healthcare or other sectors hit socially or economically. Next slide. On recovery and resilience, so this is the next step after the emergencies to see how we are going to recover. So the Commission has proposed a recovery plan for Europe in May that aims to kickstart the economy and boost green and digital transition and make a fairer and more resilient and more sustainable Europe for future generations. So I think we can see there that I think it's very clear that young people are paying the price very largely, and that we're creating also long-term, there's a very big long-term impact of this crisis that needs to be addressed in particular for them. And an instrument proposed as the Next Generation EU with a budget of 750 billion euros, including 7.5 billion for rural development. So there's been the specific focus. I think it's been clearly seen that rural areas have been hit harder. but the modalities and timing for the use of this are under heavy discussions, and so I cannot really enter into details there. And in addition to that, the multi-annual financial framework has been reinforced for rural development. The budget of the European Fund for Rural Development has been increased to 77 billion, which is around 7 billion more than what it was in the Commission proposal in May 2018. So I'm talking here in 2018 prices, in constant prices. To put it more simply, it's been clear that the farming sector and rural areas have been hit hard by the crisis and have been shown to be very essential, and the impact this has had is to say we need to shift back some resources to them when the plans to cut were bigger before. Next. So and then looking at the future, we need to really, I mean, I think it has impact on a lot. The COVID has impact on a lot of initiatives that were there before, that had been launched as part of the previous commission or as part of the new commission policy agenda. They have been launched before, but they have become even more relevant as a result of the crisis of the COVID. The European Green Deal, including the farm to fork and the biodiversity strategies and the climate law and everything related. I mean, the COVID-19 has really shown that how vulnerable maybe we are, and we need to look at all sorts of vulnerabilities, including that are related to the way we manage our environment and climate. And so you can see in the farm to fork strategies and in the biodiversity strategies links to that as well. In the CAP reform, of course, this will have an impact in the preparation of the CAP strategic plans that the member states are working on at the moment. You can be sure that this is going to modify the way they will approach it. The digital package has been released by the Commission in February, so it was before, or I say in the very early phases of the COVID crisis, but it's going to have a major impact on the capacity to progress on resilience as well. And of course, there it's very important that rural areas are on an equal footing to access the benefits of the digital transformation. And finally, and I would say, and not least, the long-term vision for rural areas that had been announced already in summer 2019 in the policy priorities of the next of this commission, is also now launched with a specific focus on COVID. Next. So the long-term vision for rural areas, it's been launched by the President, and it's under coordination of the Vice President Suika, who's the Commissioner for Democracy and Demography, and the Commissioners in charge of Agriculture and Regional Policy. And it has a focus on democracy and demography. It's very important to say it has a focus on people. So I think it's really telling that we have this work on rural areas which has this focus on people and not only on land use or on the sectoral approaches, and it is linked to demographic change, to aging, and to how communities will evolve. Of course, it will not be dealt with only under that lens. It will link to other parts like the Green Deal and the Conference on the Future of Europe and the digital transformation, but it has a focus on people and demography. I mean, the youth is part of the demography. There can be some very big room for contribution and listening there. Next. So the scope of this long-term vision exercise is to create a debate on the future of rural areas and the role they have to play in our society. And as we've heard a lot today, the perception of rural areas, the perception of their importance has shifted during COVID, and we need to make sure some of the impacts of this are long-lived and not short-lived. So this initiative will set out a vision for the future of rural areas by 2040 and gather views covering challenges, as I've said, such as demographic change, but also connectivity, low income levels, and limited access to services. But it will also explore the innovative, inclusive, and sustainable solutions in the light of climate and digital transformation and the lessons learned from the COVID crisis. And it is a cross-policy exercise. So it's not only about agriculture, it will look into the impact of all policies on rural areas. Next. So there's a dialogue process set up for this, which is really intended, the president has really said it, as a listening exercise as well. So there's been a first 2 months of consultation, or a month and a half of consultation on the roadmap that explains the process for the development of the vision. And now we entered since a week almost into the public consultation phase. So public consultation is open from until the 30th of November to contribute on this long-term vision for rural areas. And I warmly encourage every participant in this webinar to actually contribute. It's really open to all citizen, rural, urban, young, working, old, all citizens are welcome to voice their views there on both the current situation of the rural areas and on their future. There will be a conference in probably the last week of March 2021, organized by the European Network for Rural Development, to discuss the results of this consultation and of all the other streams of work that we're going to develop on this, analytical work, foresight. So there are several types of work that will feed into this, and in the adoption of a communication in the second quarter of 2021. So this is really a moment where we can have a say and make sure the voice of rural youth people, rural young people is heard. Next. So some closing reflections very quickly, because I think I ran out of time. COVID has really been a challenge for rural communities, but it's also been an opportunity to rethink our systems, to see how we can build sustainability and future resilience. In particular, I think everyone may have a different view now of what balanced development may mean, and how we need to renew our urban-rural linkages. The attention to green transition and sustainable well-being economy is increased. There's, I mean, digitalization has really accelerated, and we need to pay attention to that, both on the infrastructure front, but also the skills and what all the COVID has brought in terms of changes in the future of work that can also benefit rural areas. There are opportunities around rural tourism, around local food chains, as we've seen with the RORI story, and community solidarity has played a big role and is a strength in rural areas, as are all the networks that can help share knowledge and cope with such a situation and prepare a more resilient future. So all this needs to feed into and will feed into future policy design for rural areas. I think I'm done with that last slide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexis, for shedding light on current EU policies. Are there any questions regarding these policies for Ms. Ruby? Please feel free to ask.
I do have a question. First of all, thank you very much. I think it was really clear and informative. Concerning the vision of the rural area, you mentioned that there will be a communication next year. So this will stay, let's say, in at the level of a strategic level, or it will also, I mean, there's a vision to make it also some kind of link with the funds. So at which, let's say, normative level will this vision take place? So it will remain a kind of guideline, or it will actually influence some other policy instruments or some funding streams? I don't know if I was clear enough.
Yes, yes. Is that going to lead to action, is your question?
Exactly.
Yeah. So we all have the same ambition that it does lead to action. I think it's quite clearly put in the roadmap text. So you have a link to this in the presentation, that the communication should chart the course for future action. Of course, the policies for 21-27, they're already quite on their way, quite advanced, but yet we hope that because the member states are still working on their common agricultural policy, they're a bit more advanced on the regional policy front, so to be seen. But on the CAP as well, we hope that all the debate that is launched around this vision can also contribute to the thinking of the member states and what they want to do with the next common agricultural policy package and tools. And also having in mind, of course, what just happened and is still happening, by the way, with the coronavirus pandemic. So it's a bit of both. But then the roadmap says the communication should chart the course for future action. So we would all this will be the result of the debate. The content isn't written; it's really going to come from the consultation itself, and from the analytical work, and from the work starting on foresight, and the ruralization project for example, have as a role to play there, because it has been programmed several years ago as a foresight exercise, also to really see what the future holds in terms of mega trends and how to best prepare for this. So it's a forward-looking exercise, and the idea is to say, okay, now which actions do we need to take to best prepare for this future? And there's a new thematic group set up in the context of the European Network for Rural Development that will engage also people from the ground in participating in this vision building. And we have in mind other citizen engagement activities. So we really, I mean, it's quite clear for us that rural people don't feel listened to, and this is an opportunity also to listen.
Thank you. We have another question.
I have a question in the chat. Right?
Yes, from Mr. Hans.
Yeah, hi, Alex here. I heard there were like national experts were able to apply for kind of working groups contributing to the new rural vision.
Yes.
They were selected, weren't they?
Yes.
And
so that's what I was mentioning. So we have this European Network for Rural Development that is really the organization, the network organization in which the rural development policy is discussed, and where we exchange knowledge between the managers of rural development programs in Europe. And so a specific thematic group has been created that is called Rural 2040 to contribute to the vision as part of the different things that are launched to contribute to the vision. And there's been a call for expression of interest during summer, and people have applied. 260 people have applied, and I think between 40 and 50 have been selected to actually take part in the work, which is participatory work. So you cannot have. I mean, you need for it to be workable, and unfortunately workable and in virtual sorts of interactions, which is not what we would have liked to have, but this is what we can do, like everyone.
Are they known, or are they published, the names of the person?
I know the people who have been selected got the news yesterday.
Right, okay.
Is that also published online? I'm sure it's part of the procedure, but is that done already? I don't know.
All right, okay, thank you.
And then for people involved in the research project, so research and innovation, research and innovation projects feeding into the vision is part of the process, and we are organizing this as well. I'm doing it in various project meetings and reviews and kickoffs that we have, but we need to discuss with every project, including the 3 who are here today, how we can organize these contributions to the best, and this can be channeled through me as well, or we can think of activities, other workshops or webinars, so it's fully open.
All right, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you for your interactive discussion. Are there any other questions?
Sorry, maybe just to add, because I'm here from the ENRD contact point. So
Hi,
on the discussed. I just wanted, well, Alexia perfectly summarized the process, and where we are now is that the thematic group is already, well, the members are selected, but everything, all the outcomes will be published online. So I will just post the link and you can find everything online then. Yeah, so that's it.
All right, thank you for your contribution.
Oh, sorry, no, just to add, because I mean, being actually our project was funded under an heritage call, so sometimes for art it was hard to get connection with Agri and here the European Network of Rural Development, because we are in another box, let's say. But of course, I mean, we are working really with rural area and development, so it would be great to be involved in this consultation process.
You're in my box.
Thank you.
You're in my box, so I've done a sort of list of all the Horizon projects that are more relevant for rural. Most of them are under in our societal challenge too, because we've been funding them. Unfortunately, there are not so many things that have been done on rural in other parts, so I regret it, but we know the few. There's RURITAGE, there's Imagine, and a couple of Marie Curie's as well that I know of, but if you know of others, then they can be added to the box as well. It's a bit more complicated because we have to go through, I think it's EASME, but we know we've been in touch. I've been at your review meeting, so I think the link is there, and I'm also trying to link other rural projects to yours. Robust, so yeah, you're part of you're part of the box now.
Thank you. I see now that Veronica has posted a link in the chat on this specific topic. Make sure to check it out. And we're almost at the end of the first session. We have one last speaker, Michalis Mourovakos, the Project Officer and Directorate General of Education, Youth, Sport and Culture, on the impact of COVID on EU policies.
Hello. Hello. You can listen to me.
Hi, for you, yes.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Because I didn't see that I could unmute myself. Right. Last but not least, I hope. Will you put my presentation on the screen or?
Yes, the presentation is on the screen, and you will just tell us when to move your slides.
Right. So can we go with the first slide, please? Okay. Yes, thank you. Right. So thank you very, very much for having me, for inviting me in this webinar. I'm Michalis Mourovakos, policy officer in the youth unit, in particular, responsible for the social inclusion of young people, more particularly for the most vulnerable ones. So far, what I've heard was very interesting. All the studies, the evidence, the testimonials, definitely should be taken into account in the policy making in the future. Unfortunately, also validate our findings, which, let's say, portray a not so optimistic outlook for young people. So on my side, I would like to chip in to this webinar with some remarks, mostly from the youth policy side, what we've noticed this past months, and how this COVID has affected our policy and maybe where we should go. Yeah, my presentation is basically three pillars: how young people have responded during the crisis, how were they affected, and yeah, how our policies also are adapting to this new reality. So if we go to the next slide, please. Yes, it's what we've noticed in the last months, or immediately after the confinements and the the declaration of the pandemic is that several grassroots projects across the EU demonstrated how the youth sector could be in value, and youth organizations showed great resilience, great adaptability and creativity in mitigating the crisis. We saw mobilizing of young volunteers who took different actions, like, for example, fighting fake news, providing mental health advice, supporting disadvantaged youth and other risk groups, and so on. So this was, let's say, a spontaneous bottom-up response. Many of these participants were European Solidarity Corps participants, one of our flagship programs in the youth sector. Yeah, we witnessed small acts of kindness and compassion in a big spectrum, such as sewing masks, doing grocery and medicine shopping for elders, which in turn help minimize risk of infection. Young people demonstrated the importance of intergenerational solidarity, and all these efforts have, let's say, given recognition to youth work and the youth sector in general as an important partner in helping our society. The second slide, please, is basically evidence from at least 4 surveys that have come to our attention, one of which was presented earlier by Nikita from the European Youth Forum. It was basically evidence that showed that youth has been affected more by the restrictive measures than other age groups, with detrimental changes to their economic and social situation, their well-being and their mental health. The surveys reported higher levels of depression, of loneliness, of tension, anxiety, and even suicidal thoughts. We found this trend to be even more prevalent than before the pandemic. So in all, the surveys show that, yeah, youth have been hit more disproportionately than other age groups. And furthermore, because youth is overrepresented in the non-standard, in the precarious and informal economy, has led to an increase of youth unemployment, as rightly was pointed out earlier, the work insecurity, and when we combine that with gaps in education, that leads to long-lasting effects on youth employability, on financial security, not only for the next couple of years, but unfortunately for decades to come. Moreover, rise of discrimination and stigma, greater social exclusion, decreased access to civic space and right participations add some additional strain. So it's not bright with bright colors the future as we see, and yeah, unfortunately, the already existing inequalities and gap will only exacerbate, and we have to avoid that. How to do that is a question. It is crucial that the various economic measures that will be launched by the public authorities, by the governments, in response to the pandemic will be applied through a youth, but also an intergenerational lens. And this is crucial if we want to avoid this widening the gap. Governments and policymakers should come with timely initiatives, with stimulus packages, policies targeted at youth, especially the most vulnerable among them, such as the rural youth. We should help them update national youth strategy and disaggregate the data to see how youth specifically is affected compared to the rest of the society. And there should be forward-looking strategies that would ensure inclusive youth participation in decision-making. This was a point that was also mentioned earlier, and it's very correct. because we need to secure positive long-term change in all aspects of youth lives. So this is a key message that comes up from the studies of we have in our hand from the first evidence. I have put links with the sources so you could for reference. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So how our policies in the youth field have been affected so far. It goes without saying that an area of policy like ours, which promotes mobility, has been affected deeply. Erasmus Plus and the European Solidarity Corps have to respond to these uncertainties with maximum flexibility within, of course, the limits of the applicable legal framework. Discover EU, another program of ours, which promotes the mobility of 18-year-old Europeans across the EU, has been paused. Of course, it's only temporary, but yeah, we had to pause all these mobility programs because yeah, we had to stay at home. We adopted other initiatives within our programs to respond to the COVID. We also revised the Erasmus Plus work program with 200 million extra to boost digital education skills development and inclusion through creativity and the arts to provide a response to the crisis. In terms of policy making, for 2021, we are preparing a council recommendation, which will be a key initiative regarding the mobility of young volunteers across the EU. This is basically updating the policy framework for the young volunteers and solidarity activities across the EU, which already existed since 2008. The initial plan was to have it ready for a year, but due to the COVID, we had a little bit to postpone our initiative to also take into account the current context. So yeah, a big initiative of us has been affected and has been enriched with new features such as the health and safety of young volunteers, which we will further emphasize, putting specific support measures in place. Furthermore, digital volunteering gains momentum, which also has become highly relevant in the COVID-19 context, and given the need for social distancing for the period to follow, yeah, we see that digital volunteering will become more and more popular in the months to come. So there is a value there, and we plan on supporting it. And another important aspect that came up was the intergenerational solidarity. So all these topics, we are acknowledging them, we take stock of them, and we aim on supporting policies and action in these areas. And yeah, supporting more grassroots projects that promote these issues are among our plans. But yeah, generally, I must say that, and as it is fairly obvious that this crisis has deeply affected us, and we are definitely working to adapt in this reality, and we will have to put young people at the center of all the recovery measures to come. So that would conclude my presentation. As I said, it's basically mostly remarks of what has happened and where we stand at the youth policy unit and the youth sector in that regard. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michaelis, for your contribution. We have a question from Ms. Ruby. She asked, what are you referring to when you say digital volunteering?
Yes, digital volunteering. So basically, digital volunteering is an alternative way to volunteer when you are unable to go to the physical site. So it has many facets. We saw it. Sorry, during the COVID-19 in particular, which it could take many forms. Let's say maintaining a website, translating text, editing a video, designing flyers. There are so many different aspects of that. Managing social media accounts, sharing digital skills with all the generations. The most famous, I think, initiative of digital volunteering would be Wikipedia, to give an illustrating example.
Okay,
Does
thank
this
you.
answer?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Are there any other questions now for Michaelis or in general on the whole webinar? All right, if there are no more questions, we come to the end of the session. Thank you so much for your participation at this webinar. We hope the gathered information is relevant and useful to you. We will publish the recorded session online in case you want to listen to it again or share with your peers or coworkers. Once again, I would like to invite you to visit the Ruralization website and social media channels and to register to our newsletter to be informed about future events and activities. A special thank you to all the speakers who took the time in their busy schedules to share their knowledge with us today. All of us here from Consulta Europa and Ruralization wish you a nice day. May you stay safe and healthy. Adios.
Goodbye. Thanks to the organizers.